Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching and listening. Super special episode today. It's going to be a little bit different. Got Dr. Brody King, and we're interviewing Darshan Kulkarni, the one and only. We're actually writing a book on medical devices, which we're going to have Darshan as a contributor listed. And this podcast is really going to be about medical devices. We're going to get deep in the trenches. An expert, he's a plastic surgeon, and he's someone who really is scratching his own itch when it comes to writing this book. So thank you both for coming on, and let me get out of the way, really. Dr. King, feel free to take over.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Dan. Yeah, like Dan was saying, I'm actually a plastic surgery resident in Houston, Texas, and I'm very interested in medical device development. It's always been something that I've had a passion for. I studied at the University of Utah in bioengineering and worked on, a host of different medical devices, everything from microfluidics to surgical robots, a bunch of stuff in between. And so, I had some issues on the clinical side figuring out how to actually study these devices and do studies of off-service uses of devices and trying to get more into the weeds of actually developing a device, taking it to the market and doing the clinical trials, which is what brought me to Dan's neck of the woods. And then in doing so, we want to just talk to as many experts as we can in the field to basically get the most comprehensive view of the process for our readers. And that brings us to, taking in Dr. Kulkarni. So thank you so much for joining us. Would you mind just kind of quickly talking about your background? And I know you've been an author and you've written about medical device development and law and how that works. Can you kind of just talk about your background as it applies to devices specifically?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. My name is Darshan Kulkarni. Educationally, I have a doctorate in pharmacy. I'm a Juris Doctor, so I'm an attorney. I also have a master's in quality assurance and regulatory affairs. I have a fellowship in interprofessional geriatric care, and I clerked in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania for a federal court judge. I work-wise, I was general counsel, chief compliance officer for a startup out of the University of Pennsylvania. I was a VP of regulatory strategy and policy for a global consulting company, one of the largest medical writing companies in the world. I taught medical writing since 2009 at the University of the Sciences, where I taught the law and ethics portion. I also taught promotion of biomedical products. And now I teach law at Drexel University in their law school. I teach food and drug law, and I teach promotional compliance again. And I'm redoing syllabi right now. I also serve on multiple boards, both advisory and editorial. I also have my own law firm that does FDA regulatory law and compliance. So I get involved with medical devices all the time. In fact, I'm working with some right now. All types of medical devices, including everything from sort of your diagnostics to your lab developed tests, which will now potentially fall under the FDA's jurisdiction, to the more complex ones, if you will. I've been involved in them in a few different ways, everything from regulatory strategy development to an M&A sort of perspective and how that gets played out. Hey, Chris, how are you? Good to see you.
Good, Darshan. Yourself?
I'm doing well. Just doing introductions, if you will.
Okay.
And so teaching, writing, speaking. Oh, I speak all over the world on research, promotional compliance, regulatory strategy, Sunshine Act requirements, compliance issues, M&A types of issues. I think there's more, but I'm sure that sort of gives everyone a flavor for what I do.
Very cool. Very cool. So it sounds like you have a lot of very relevant experience in this world. One thing that we're actually going to talk a little bit about in the book is the case of Theranos, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, because I know you just brought up lab-derived tests. Yeah. And so, on that note, one thing that I was interested in exploring and talking to, exploring for the readers would be the implications of design choices on the FDA regulatory pathway and what is the ethical and the legal ramifications for making a design change that could potentially move you into one category, a class 2 versus a class 3. Because I think a lot of people say, I want this device that does these 3 things. And maybe the first 2 things are the ones that the doctors actually care about. They're the bread and butter of the device, but maybe that third thing pushes you to, well, that third thing, if you want it, now makes you a class 3 device. Or maybe you're not actually a class 2, you're a lab derived test, like all the implications for design. Have you had experience with clients where there's a small change in design that has affected the regulatory pathway, and how do you counsel your clients when that happens?
I think for me, the key piece is discussing goals. And as a lawyer, one of the things we're taught, and this is to, I expect, both Dan and Chris's chagrin, it's never quite giving the answer. It's always kind of going, here are some options, here are the risks that go along with it. So what you find yourself doing often is going, look, you can do ABC, and that might make you a PMA. You need pre-market approval. The risk is pretty high. You need to decide how important this other version is, but you might be what's called a 510K, which means that you get to come on, you get to daisy chain off of previously approved products. And it's not my job to tell you don't do something unless I'm speaking in a compliance role. My job is to enable you as a client to make a decision that's right for you. For example, some docs may go, I think 1 and 2 are important, but 3 is actually what's going to enable me to sell the product. And you'll see this all the time, where you'll go, I can be the 14th device on the market and I'm fighting for market share. Or I can be the first device that's been approved for A, and that gives me certain advantages, and I'm willing to take that risk and the cost that goes along with it. An example of that might be the Jarvis heart, for example. Yeah, maybe, and the Jarvis heart was kind of unique, if you will. But this 13th guy who comes up with the Jarvis heart, he may go, well, how do I differentiate myself from everything else before me? And that becomes a really important question, because if you don't have anything to differentiate yourself, how are you going to make your money back? And patients, appropriately so, question the value of why these devices are so expensive, not counting the compliance costs, not counting the regulatory costs. These additional studies that have to be done to prove claims is what makes some devices pretty expensive. Obviously not in every single case, but that might be playing into the role. Is that responsive?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what we want to talk about and explore in this book specifically are all of the different perspectives that go into these decisions. So, you just did a really good job kind of explaining, it's maybe more of a business and strategic decision that you want to have these indications for the device.
Yeah.
But maybe from the clinical perspective, maybe the surgeons don't really care that much, but you think that's going to really help you sell the device and it puts a shiny bow on it. But is that shiny bow worth an extra $100 million in
Right.
clinical? And if you're going to spend that extra $100 million to have an additional design feature that at the end of the day, doctors don't really care about, what's the point? And so
I think that's the key portion, right? It depends on which doctor. So a plastic surgeon may not, but a heart surgeon may. In which case, who is your target audience? And that becomes a key piece as well. What does your database look like? Do you have, for example, I've seen this happen all the time, where you own one device and this is an add-on to a device you already own. In which case, you may want to, even though you can go after the lower sort of option, you go, I want to go after this higher option because I already have the market ready for this. And that becomes another choice you make. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, totally. And I think we've seen that in multiple different examples. I think the Jarvis heart is a great example. There's also, some of the products like the TAVRs, the transaortic valve replacements. I think one of them that came out, Boston Scientific came out with a device. They were like third to market, but they had this new indication. And it ended up being that, they had this new technology. And one of the big selling points was the ability that you can take out and manipulate and reposition the valve. And that was the big selling point for their market. And it sounds great. And they did the studies. But then when it came down to it and it hit the market, the surgeons were having a really hard time actually doing the repositioning, and they ended up having issues in the OR. And it turned out that they said, patients who have the valve and it's in place, it's safe, it's not going to have any issues. But we did have some issues when surgeons were trying to reposition it.
Right.
And so we're going to withdraw from the market, and they took a loss on that entire product.
Yeah, and that's a risk you take. Absolutely.
And assumingly they did additional studies to prove that out and to get those new indications.
Yes, there's also guidance from the FDA on how do you refurbish previously used devices. So depending on how that gets interpreted, that may be relevant as well. So is a device that gets moved within the body still considered to be refurbished? I don't know, but reusing. So is it two separate events or is it the same event? Is what comes into play.
I think for that example specifically, I believe it was the same event. It's just like if you deployed it here and you wanted to move it a centimeter, you could do it with that device, versus that may not be possible with the others.
You could 100% be right. I'm not challenging you. I just don't know enough about the facts here.
Right.
Because again, it also comes down to how CMS sees that, right? Because CMS could say, we see it as two events and we reimburse based on two events because you're going into the heart, removing the old heart, old, what do you call it? Flap. No, not flap. They're removing the old device and then putting in a new device, even though it's technically the same device. So it depends on how you categorize the action, if you will. So that would play a role.
That's
not a reimbursement person, but yeah.
So then when there is, fuzzy language, things can be interpreted. Then what is, as a lawyer, what is your role in like dealing with if you're representing the company and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, is this a reusable or not? Like, how do you approach talking to the company and then talking to the FDA, and how does that conversation go?
So in many cases, these conversations land up being more of a, what do you want to do? So if you're talking PMA, you might be saying, you know what, I want to reach out to the FDA, start talking about which types of studies you want us to do to be able to make the claims that we want to make. The vast majority of my clients don't want to go down that path. I would say the vast majority want to be down the 510K route because no one wants to wait that long to bring a device to market. So if that's true, they would essentially go, what is the risk that I am not a 510K? So my job often is also going, let's see what the current technology is. What is the current state of the art? Then let's compare it to what you're doing. Does it raise new questions of safety and efficacy? And if that's true, then maybe we have to consider from a risk-based perspective what each of these is. You might look at FDA guidances on the topic. You might look at the 510Ks to see what they actually define things as and go, here's my professional recommendation in some cases. Here is my legal recommendation, which can be two separate things. So that there's a regulatory recommendation, there's a legal recommendation, and then there is a business decision. Which one are you making? And my job is to inform you, educate you so that you can make the decision that's right for you.
Do sponsors or device manufacturers, whoever owns the IP, do they ever get a choice? Or do they ever get to sit down with the FDA and hear from them, hey, we think you should go PMA. If you go, you can go this 510 route, but if you do, it's less likely we're going to approve. Or are you just flying blind?
No, you're usually not flying blind. You do not want to get into a PMA without some input, if you will. You might find yourself in a more problematic place. 510Ks, you often quote unquote fly blind, but that's come back to bite companies as well, where they've flown blind only to be told you don't have, this should have been a PMA.
Is the FDA ever ambiguous? Like not really giving you a right or wrong answer?
So the FDA will never tell you what to do. That's not their job because you'll hold the FDA responsible. The FDA will say, prove to me whatever you want to ask me, you can ask me. I'm not going to answer the question in terms of telling you what to do, but I will tell you what factors we consider and how they be like. If you are saying this is a 510K, prove to me why it's a 510K. And you'll go, I do this, and this. Okay, we agree. Okay. Or I do this, and this. But what about blah and blah? Oh, I hadn't thought of those.
Okay. Is there a charge to speak with the FDA and a waiting list? And is it multiple opportunities? Can you kind of just walk us through some of those nuances?
Sure. So generally speaking, there is a charge, but the charge comes often out of your application fees. So there's what's called PDUFA, MEDUFMA, and these are basically your application fees. And in exchange for that, you'll get timely conversations with the FDA and the like as well. Get input from them, feedback from them, more. And those fees get updated every year.
And the last one, just how often I would imagine there's people that would abuse the meetings with the FDA. Like, does the FDA have a limit? Hey, we won't meet with you more than once or twice, or
No,
things like
so
that.
the FDA is not usually picky like that. What they'll usually go is have a very clear list of questions. So you can't go in there and say, let's have a conversation. You've got to send in like a list of here's what we want to talk about. Here's the agenda. Here's why we're saying this. So the FDA has a chance to prepare. They might bring in 1, 2, 3, 10, 15, 20 experts. I'm not saying they usually do, but they can. And that will guide the conversation because the FDA doesn't like to be caught flat-footed. They like to be prepared for their meeting. You can get some. There's the ombudsman and the like you can reach out to, and they'll be able to give you some guidance. Again, you might want to talk to the specific person within the department you're talking to. Hopefully, it helps.
Yeah. So also part of what we want to talk about, is for the young investigator or the startup founder. You're saying all of this stuff. We need to talk to the FDA. How do I do that? Do I go to fda.gov and
You
find someone
can.
and just them, or what? Like what is it? Do you have to have a lawyer who's versed in these conversations? Like how do you get that process rolling?
So usually speaking, it depends on how you're coming into this. So if you are a multi-billion-dollar company, say you're Medtronic for argument's sake, you have a team of people who already has relationships with the FDA, and they send an email and go, hey, can we have a conversation about this new thing we're bringing to the market? Yeah, I kind of know where it's going to go. Some of these people have worked at the FDA already, and they'll go, I can tell you what they're going to say, but if you want, we can have a conversation. That's one version. Another version might be you reach out and you got a CRO to help you, a clinical research organization. They'll have relationships with the regulatory people who can reach out to the FDA. Let's say you are a solo entrepreneur who's never done anything like this before. You're bringing your first product to market. You have no CRO. You don't want to hire a lawyer. You don't want to hire a regulatory person. You could theoretically look up the FDA website and say, small business, who do I need to talk to? Pull up the phone number, talk to someone. You often have to leave a voicemail. They'll call you back. It's not going to be like tomorrow, but it'll happen. And kind of go from there.
And in terms of, talking about, the nuances of, figuring out what is the classification for my device. I think based on what I see in the marketplace, I think it's a 510K, but I want to do this one little thing that's going to make me different in the market, but I don't think increases the risk to the level of a PMA. Like, what do you think? Who do I need to talk to? Is it the same conversation, or is that a separate conversation to kind of determine the classification and the pathway that you need to move forward with?
I would talk to people who are well versed the art. I would not. I work with clinicians all the time, and my experience with clinicians is that they're very good clinically. But just like you are good clinically, there are people who spend their entire lifetimes learning about regulatory work, and reading a description on an FDA website is not going to give you the same information as doing that for the last 20 years. So talk to people who've done that for 20 years. Ask them questions. Go, what do you think? If you want, you can get 2, 3, 4 opinions. The truth is, my experience is that, and Dan's had this problem, Chris has had this problem. They'll go, different people have different opinions, and it's often easier to just follow an opinion as long as you trust the person, you think that they're well versed, because there are different opinions with different strategies, and there's often more than one way to skin that proverbial cat.
Right. Okay. And then another question that I had for you. So in cases where you have an idea, you think that it probably would be helpful to patients, you have the general, the prototype figured out. At what stage, how does the intellectual property pathway merge with the FDA pathway? Because also these design implications that are going to push you one way versus the other are also going to be reflected in your patents. And if you make your public disclosure and you have your 1 year to file your full patent, and then you come back and you realize that what I just put a patent for didn't have the key design feature that would change my pathway, at what point do you recommend people, do you recommend getting the broadest patent you can try for and hope they get accepted? Because also the patent process, takes years to get approved.
So in many ways, the patent process and the regulatory process are comically the exact opposite. In the patent process, your entire job is to go, this is the greatest thing ever. No one's ever seen this. You are lucky that you get to read my patent because it's mind-blowing. No one's ever seen this thing. And then you take that same exact thing, then go to the FDA and go, this is exactly the same thing as the last one. You don't need to do any approvals, just approve it right now. So even though you're looking at the same exact thing, you're telling two different stories. So the question lands up being, how do you start and where do you start? So I like to, first of all, if an entrepreneur came to me and said, I have this great, I've had these conversations, which is why it's funny. I'm thinking of a specific doctor when I say this. Really nice guy. Reached out to me about 2016, 2017. He was super nice. And he had a great idea. And I said, first of all, have you looked, because when you're at that size, you often don't want to spend the money, right? It's your money coming out of your pocket, and that's hard. It's easier when it's a company's money. It's easier when you just are an employee for someone and it doesn't feel personal. You are the doctor, every dollar feels like it's coming out of your pocket, and it is. So my experience with him, and he was wonderful, was we first said, why don't you start looking at do a patent search? You see what shows up. He's like, well, no one's doing this because I work in this space. And I was like, just because you work in the space doesn't mean that there's no patent for it.
Right.
So you need to start by doing a little bit of due diligence for yourself. Did someone else think about it and then go, I don't want to pursue it? In which case, why didn't they want to pursue it? Or is it already obvious in terms of what's already been done? So it's just a variant of something that someone already has said. So let's say you can get past all those patent questions. And if you guys have questions about where to find a patent lawyer, just reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you with patent lawyers. I am not a patent lawyer. But then you start going, okay, I have a patent in place. I have an idea for a patent. I can get that. Maybe you'll file your provisional patent. You'll then start thinking about, okay, regulatory strategy wise, do I even need FDA approval? So you talked about lab developed tests. Lab developed tests as they presently exist, I think presently, there's some timelines that kick in right now. They are, you don't necessarily need FDA approval. You may be able to basically come to the market very quickly. That has been deemed to be problematic, possibly getting challenged. And currently the FDA is saying that we need you to get FDA approval. But I would start looking at, what does your analysis look like? What do I need to prove? Because while you talked about patents taking a long time, the regulatory process takes even longer. So right. Considering how long it takes, I like to start as soon as possible. So you start going, what is my TPP, my total product profile? What are the things I want to have in there? What are the things I must have in there? What are the things I don't need to have in there? Put them all together and then decide these are nice to haves, must haves, etc. Then put them all together and go, okay, regulatory guy, tell me what you think. What is my risk looking like? How much money do I need to raise to fund this thing? Oh, you're going to fund this from your own pocket? Okay. What do you need to prove? Am I going to reach out to the FDA? Am I going to do a 510K? Am I 510K exempt? Do I not even need a 510K because I'm a totally different pathway? What does my process look like? And then let that guide what your next steps look like. Is that responsive?
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Absolutely. I think, the timelines get muddy, and I think that's why it's important when you first start out and you say, I want to create this new device. Yeah. I think it's just important to know that all of these variables are coming at you, and these are all things that you need to consider.
Absolutely.
So, and the implications of each of them and how they can work. One thing that you did, bring up there is, which I thought was interesting, is talking about just because it's not in the market doesn't mean there aren't patents for it, and
Right.
someone else may have explored it and decided to not pursue it. And I think a lot of people don't have the first clue of how to start a patent search. And I've do very preliminary searches, and I think the tools online through the USPTO website have actually gotten a lot better over time for searching through patents.
Yep.
And so, we'll definitely include, I think, a QR code or a link in our book to help people just get their first start, where to look and where to find.
You can also
Where
look at Google has a patent search as well.
Yeah.
So that's a good resource as well. But the USPTO is obviously better, but it
Yeah.
can be a little bit difficult, if you will.
And I'm sure if there aren't already in development, there will be AI-enabled patent search tools that are going to come out soon. Because just like even in the last couple of months, I became aware of this AI search tool called Semantic Scholar that's better than Google Scholar at finding the papers you want, because it's not just searching key terms, it's looking at like related content. So I'm sure that exists or will exist at some point.
I've spoken to some of my software clients who are doing exactly that. So that's coming.
Yeah. And so I think all of this kind of revolution in information with AI probably will also contribute to helping us as investigators and developers get to that information.
So you have to be careful. You have to be careful. One of the big problems you have is, and you and Dan were talking about this a little bit before I got on, but a lot of people are starting to depend on AI to help them sort of develop their product. The problem you have to consider is, and again, I'm not a patent lawyer, just want to be very clear. So talk to a patent lawyer for advice that's right for you. But generally speaking, if it's not created by a human, the patent office may have problems, and you should check into that. Will they have a problem with allowing a patent for you? So whether you're talking about framing the patent or you're talking about developing the product itself, just be careful about how you use AI in that process, because it could compromise your intellectual property rights.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I was reading an article a couple of months ago that I'll need to clarify the sources, but it was talking, can AI be a co-inventor on a patent? And I think the conclusion was no. But I'm sure that all of this is kind of subject to be revisited in the coming years.
No one knows the answer. The answer no is preliminary. Not saying they're wrong. It's just preliminary.
Right. And then another thing to talk about that I think would be interesting to get your take on is, from everything that I can see from my experience, the FDA really is not interested at all in if you are solving a clinical problem that matters, and if what you're doing is going to help people necessarily. They just, from my perspective, they want to make sure that you're not going to hurt anybody with the technology, so it's safe. And they do want it to be effective, but they don't necessarily, there's a lot of talk about like non-inferiority in these devices and in the trials. So can you talk a little bit about, like, what is the FDA's experience or perspective in your experience from developing a new, better product, versus does the FDA just want to make sure it's not going to hurt people and it's not worse?
So I'm going to use the word product right now more expansively. So we've talked about devices, and in the end, you have to prove safety and efficacy, and safety and effectiveness, if you will. But when you talk about drugs, for example, you have similar problems. You have to prove, and you talk about things like, and I recognize you're a surgeon, so obviously devices have a lot more impact on what you do on a day-to-day basis than drugs. But the FDA is not going to compromise the standards around, as you said, safety and efficacy, depending on the goals, because there are so many situations where that's come back to bite the FDA, where something was deemed to be a huge problem, turns out it doesn't work as well as you thought it would. So they don't usually want to compromise on safety and efficacy. Having said that, if you are solving that type of problem, the FDA does go in many ways out of its way to help you bring the product to market faster. And there are different approval pathways that may be available You might be looking at a humanitarian use exemption, which might be useful as well. There are different strategies, and again, this is where you talk to experts to go, here's what I'm doing, here's the problem I'm solving. It only affects 5 people in the entire world. Well, in ultra rare cases, the FDA goes, maybe you don't need all the studies that we were talking about. Maybe there's a different pathway we can consider. Talk to your regulatory people. They have to do some research to see what might be specifically applicable in your case.
Gotcha. And you talked all. Oh, go ahead.
So I'm sorry. For example, I'm talking about rare diseases and drugs right now. The typical standard for most drugs is you need 2 double-blinded placebo-controlled multi-center multinational studies. That's called substantial evidence for the most part. In rare disease states, it's hard to get that many patients. So the FDA often goes, we'll accept 1 in some cases. And that's been challenged. And for the most part, FDA has sort of stood by where they are. So to argue that they don't care would be unfair. I think they are regulatory limited, for example, but they try to work with you.
Gotcha. And it kind of along similar lines there, are you familiar with, I guess, what it would take in terms of additional studies to expand the indications for a product rather than get a new product involved? Like, for example, one thing that I've been seeing more and more of is robotic surgery with the Da Vinci system. And last year I wrote a book chapter on breast surgery. There's a couple groups in Asia and China that are using the Da Vinci robot for mastectomies. And in the US, basically that's not approved. There are a couple ongoing trials. But can you tell, our audience a little bit more about the difference in studies and the FDA oversight for expanding indications for an existing product versus getting a brand new product?
Yeah. So a few different responses to that. So number one, you've got to be careful. So let's be very clear. Off-label promotion is prohibited in many cases, though that's changing as well. Off-label use is completely legal. The doctor can do whatever they want as they deem fit. So using a product for the indication you want is completely okay to do. You may have some reimbursement questions that you have to answer later on, but that's a CMS question, not an FDA question. Let's then move to the second question, which from a can I sort of do additional studies? Well, it depends on where you got pushed, right? So you're going for an additional indication. Does that indication move you from 510K to PMA? Changes the entire regulatory structure again. Does that indication keep you within the 510K? In which case, why are you really doing the studies? Are you trying to get an additional 510K? In which case, what does that actually need to be proven? So there's no way to answer that question without it's a very fact-specific inquiry.
I see. So in this example, let's say me as a plastic surgeon, I want to use a robot to harvest a latissimus dorsi flap.
That's what I was thinking.
It's not indicated. It's
Right.
not current. It's not something that the Da Vinci reps can say is what their robots are used for,
Correct.
because it's approved indication. I, as a surgeon, am allowed to use it.
Yep.
Because it's at my discretion whether I use that device or not.
Right.
But then the difference would be, can the Stryker representatives can't tell me that I can use it for the latissimus dorsi?
Sales reps cannot tell you. The medical affairs people absolutely can. So it depends on who you're talking to.
Okay, can you kind of go through that a little bit more?
Sure. So sales reps are engaged in what's called commercial speech. I've literally written the book chapter on that as well. But sales reps are engaged in commercial speech. They're advertising. And I'm sticking with I'm going to call it pre-20 because the post-2020 law is very, very fuzzy at best. And I can discuss that if you like. But essentially, the rule is off-label speech. Sales reps have to stay on label. You can ask them questions, but they're only allowed to speak on label. Off-label, if you're engaged in what's called scientific discussion, so you're talking to another surgeon, you're talking to a PhD, you're talking to the guy who invented this and is a scientist. Though in the case of drugs, if you're talking to a PharmD, in those cases, you are engaged in scientific discussion, and the FDA would would basically go, I understand you're having that conversation. They're not engaged in the role of selling you stuff. They're engaged in the role of educating you. And the FDA has very limited regulatory powers in regulating scientific discussion. So you can ask those people off-label conversation, engage in those off-label conversations. They can absolutely have those conversations with you. So you can go, look, I know your product's approved for this. I need to use it in this other patient. What is the evidence that works? Sales rep probably shouldn't be answering that question. I'll tell you right now, you've been in the OR when this has happened. They've answered that question. But the truth is they shouldn't be answering that question. What they should be doing is going, let me find a medical affairs person who can answer the question. They'll bring the phone to you and you'll have that conversation into as much depth as you would like. Happens all the time.
Okay. So then I guess related to that point, if I want to use the robot to do that surgery and I'm using it off label, what am I allowed to do in terms of interacting with the rep in terms of support for the device? Because let's say I have the reps in the room every single time I do a robotic case for the indicated procedure.
Let's ignore the HIPAA problems associated with that, but keep going.
Right. But let's say the device reps are in the room, they're helping out.
Sure.
If they typically come for this procedure that is allowed based on the indications for the device, are they allowed to help me use the product during this off-label in terms of technical support?
Define technical support here.
Like, oh, I'm having trouble moving this arm. Can you help me set up the robot better? Can you help me? I'm having issues docking the robot. Like, can you help me troubleshoot this docking problem?
So does it happen every single day? Yeah, happens every single day. If I was compliant for one of those medical device companies, here's my thought process. How much liability are you taking setting up that device as the sales rep? What are you answering? Are you engaged in the practice of medicine? Because you're not qualified. You're a sales rep. Those are the types of questions I'm going into. Now you're saying, can he set up a generic device just to show you? Sure. Is he allowed to set it up for a specific patient for a specific use? Kind of pushing the line there. And when I say pushing the line, kind of crossing the line.
Right.
Because you're now going from I'm selling you a product to I'm engaged in the practice of medicine or surgery in this case. So it all comes down to what is the practice of surgery at that point. That'd be case specific.
I see.
Every state will have its own definition. Every situation will have its own definition. Is the doctor taking on the liability? Because let's imagine that the sales rep sets it up wrong. Who gets sued? The doctor obviously gets sued, but who else gets sued? If I was the lawyer in that room, lawyer that's suing, I would ask for the medical records and I would sue that medical device company a second.
And Dr. Brody, the reason I laugh, you get to feel what I deal with on a weekly basis with Darshan. He comes on to scare the shit out of people.
Oh yeah.
This is what he does. And
Like,
he's not a litigator.
I believe I'm called Baba Yaga.
Baba Yaga.
You don't know what that's from? That's John Wick.
Oh,
John Wick reference, one of the four.
One of the four. There you go.
very nice. Well, I mean, that's really good. All good things to consider.
Darshan, I suggest your next book that you write should be called Scared Shitless. You get way too serious. You're way too knowledgeable, first of all. But I think your last book before you retire, just call it Scared Shitless.
A story of diarrhea.
Any last minute questions, Dr. King or Chris?
No, sure. I think those are the big highlights. I'm sure I'm gonna have a lot more questions as I drive home later tonight. But that was really great. Thank you so much for providing all that insight for us.
Absolutely. Just to clarify, not legal advice, not clinical advice. Just talk to your lawyer.
And sales reps don't do surgery. That's what I learned from this.
Yeah. I think
and yet they do it every single day, just to be clear. You'd be surprised how often I've heard about people going, yeah, can you show me how to hold this? Like, dude, why is a guy who's a sales rep, and yes, they probably have a ton more experience with that device than you do. But the fact is, you're the doctor, and you got to be careful about what you say and do.
You can say that about every doctor. I mean, every internist has their MAs do all kinds of things they're not supposed to do.
And that's the question. What liability? But in that case, the MA works for the doctor. So the MA may get sued, but in the end, the doctor's still getting sued.
Sure.
In this specific situation, it's not that situation at all.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean, all very good things for us to consider and know. I think there's probably a lot of people who don't know the nuances of those discussions and interactions with sales reps. And I
Yeah.
think that probably is a chapter in and of itself. It's
That's a
like
book right there.
Oh,
what
wrote that
what is
chapter, but yes,
yeah,
Wait,
yeah.
pull it up, Darshan. Where's that book? Let's do a plug
I don't
right
make
here.
money off of this. Just to be clear,
Everyone
I-
buy
I-
this.
this
What
is
do you
first of all
do
an
with
old
this thing?
version. There are
It's
like
like a
multiple versions of
doorway.
it, but no, it's I don't make money off of this. Just to be clear, so and this is an old version, so yeah.
I
But
don't think authors make too much money off their books, by the way.
no, I mean I literally make zero money off of it. You do it so that
Oh,
you can say I wrote a
zero's
book.
bad. Okay.
Uh,
I'm sorry,
but-
man.
no, I did it to raise it in these types of conversations.
Well, that you are definitely doing.
Establish responsibility. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kulkarni, for your time.
Thank you so much. You don't usually get a surgeon calling the pharmacist Dr. Lagarni, but I'll take it.
Thank you guys. Guru
Thank you.
Nation, go follow Darshan underneath. And by the time you're watching this, the book might be out. The Comprehensive Guide to Medical Device Development and Clinical Trials, Advancing Standard of Care Together by Dr. Brody King, with a lot of help from Darshan on this podcast, and probably many more calls. Thank you guys very much. Go follow everybody. Bye-bye.